What's up, True Crime World? You're here with Luminol on the Wall. I'm Becky.
And I'm Bevy. And today's case is about a father who is so desperate to keep his secret that he will do anything to save face. This is the case of Dylan Redwine. Listeners' discretion is advised. Hey guys, welcome to this week's episode of LOTW. And hey Beck.
Oh, hey, Bev.
What's good in the hood?
Well, a lot is good, but what is not good is I sliced my finger with a mandolin.
Classic.
I just got it. Worst part is I was using the protective thing to
Slider.
hold the slider. Just got lazy with my pinky finger.
Just let it
Just
dip
mandolin my finger
while you were
almost
making me
right
dinner.
off. I know.
What
The
a
things
shame.
I do for you.
I know.
Oh, God.
The pain you have to suffer
It's a
at
lot.
the cost of feeding your darling sister.
Clearly the cost is a lot. It bled so much.
I bet.
And it just wouldn't stop. And now I have this giant ass Band-Aid.
That you got me to cut the tip off of?
Yes.
Cut the tip.
Cut the tip because it kept getting wet and touching things. Oh,
Becky.
no. I
Oh,
meant like,
that was gnarly.
okay. The context, I was cooking, so therefore I'm washing my hands, trying to keep my finger.
Your finger.
My
I know you were
finger.
trying to think of pinky finger,
Yeah,
but you
yeah,
said finger.
My finger.
That was great.
Try to keep it out of the water. Try to keep it, from touching the vegetables that I still had to cut and all that stuff. That was the context. Get your minds out of the effing gutter, okay?
I
Food
can't.
prep. Food prep, Beverly.
You said tip and wet in the same sentence. Like, come on.
I'm sorry.
My mind's not in the gutter. It's just the only reasonable way that my mind can go.
Except food prep. It could have gone there.
It could've.
You even knew the context.
It could have, but that would have been hella boring. Just saying.
And we ain't boring. Okay, fire.
Okay. Well, anyways, let's get into the case for today because from what you have told me about it, it's rather nasty.
It has its moments, yeah.
Okay, so let's get into it.
All right.
So in 2012, on Thanksgiving weekend, 13-year-old Dylan Redwine is going to see his father in Bayfield, Colorado. His parents, who are named Mark and Elaine, have been separated since 2007, but at the time Dylan goes to visit his dad, Mark, his mother has full custody of him. However, that being said, the courts have allowed semi-regular visits between Mark and Dylan. So Dylan arrives for the long weekend and his dad picks him up at the airport. But Dylan didn't really want to be there, so he just goes ahead and decides to make plans with his friend Ryan for the same evening that he arrived in Colorado. Which is kind of like a dick move for a kid to do.
Yeah, you haven't seen your dad in a little while. I'm just going to make other plans.
Yeah.
But also, what a teenager move.
Totally. I understand it, but still, he's kind of a dick for it, I have to say.
A little bit.
That being said, Mark completely kiboshes his son's plans with his friends because, as we kind of alluded to earlier, it's a dick move. His dad wants to spend time with him.
Mm-hmm.
So Dylan throws his dad a bone. He reschedules his plans with his friend for the next morning at 6:30 a.m. He's like, I'll give you this night, Dad. I'll give you this night. But tomorrow, 6:30 a.m., I'm out of here.
With my friends.
Exactly. So Mark and Dylan, they go have dinner at McDonald's. They go to Walmart, and then they make their way home. The next morning, Mark wants Dylan to come with him to run some errands. So he tries to wake him up around 7 a.m.
So he's obviously slept through an alarm. He's not with his friend.
So his dad's like, hey, maybe you can come run errands with me.
Yeah.
But Dylan didn't want to get up. Again, classic teenager.
Realizing this is far too early. Leave me the hell alone.
Exactly. Come back at 11.
Yeah.
So Mark just heads out and does his chores all on his lonesome. He goes to his divorce attorney's office and his work's payroll office, and he returns home around 11:30 a.m. And when he arrives, Dylan's nowhere to be found, and all of his personal belongings are gone. But Mark wasn't too concerned. He had known that his son wanted to see his friend and just thought He was probably off hanging out with his buddy. So Mark decides to have a nap and doesn't wake up until around 2:30 in the afternoon. And when Mark wakes up from his slumber, he realizes that Dylan is still not home. And he's not overly concerned by this, but he wants to just make sure that Dylan is okay. So he goes to a couple of Dylan's friends' houses just to see and make sure that he was with one of them. But every friend that Mark spoke to said that they had not heard from nor seen Dylan at all. And Ryan, who Dylan had made plans with for that morning, also said that he had not seen Dylan that day and had not heard from him since he reached out to make plans with him. So after checking with Dylan's friends, Mark was even more concerned than he had been previously and decided to head to the Bayfield Marshal's office around 5 p.m. to notify them that Dylan was in fact missing at this point. This was on November 19th of 2012. Mark had told the marshal that he was not able to find Dylan all day and that the last time that he saw him was at 7 a.m. that morning. But at the time that he reported all of this to the marshal, he didn't file a missing persons report.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, I think maybe he's a little bit concerned, but again, not to the point of filing a missing persons report. Maybe Dylan had just kind of gone off and done his own thing. So he's treating it as though it's a worry to him, but not necessarily an immediate concern, if that makes sense. So a little later that evening, when Mark still hasn't heard from or seen Dylan, he decides to call Dylan's mom, Elaine, to tell her that he had not seen Dylan since that morning and that neither had his friends. Mark was casual when he was telling Elaine all of this, but what was weird is that Elaine also hadn't heard from her son. And something was just not sitting right with her about all of this. So she immediately calls the Lapata County Sheriff's Office and she files a missing persons report.
Wow, that's crazy to have two parents
respond so differently. But it could just be that Elaine has a closer relationship with her son, so she realizes when her son is acting out of character, as opposed to Mark, who doesn't see him very often, might just think, is this weird? Or is this just how he is? I don't know.
Oh, exactly. And on kind of a side note, is Elaine was in constant contact with her son from the time he landed at the airport till around 9:30 at night, I assume around bedtime, but she had not heard from him the following day at all. So she was like, oh,
this is weird for my son and I's communication.
Exactly.
So after Elaine files this missing persons report, her husband Mike and her oldest son Corey all hop in the car and they drive down to Bayfield.
The whole family.
The whole family. And when you think of their actions, it clearly outlines how severe and concerning they thought this situation to be.
Yes, it does.
My son is gone. I haven't heard from him. The dad's being casual, but they're like, this is not right. And it's absolutely out of character for Dylan.
Exactly. Let's drive down there and take action.
Absolutely. So before we get into what happened next, let's talk about the Redwine family, because there's a lot of history there. And I want to let you know, how did they get to this point where the parents are separated and Dylan doesn't really want to see his dad, etc. So Mark and Elaine had gotten married in 1989 and they were living in Colorado. The couple had had 2 boys together and they were 7 years apart. The oldest son was Corey and Dylan was the youngest son. Mark also had children from a previous relationship and he tried to balance the dynamic of having children from 2 different families. Mark and Elaine did have a pretty stable relationship and everyone around them thought that the family was pretty nice, and it seemed from the outside that they really loved each other. That being said, the Redwine's marriage did start to deteriorate, and around 2007, the couple separated and then they eventually got divorced. At the time of their divorce, Dylan was 8 years old and his brother was 15. Initially, when they divorced, the couple shared custody of the boys, but eventually Mark and Elaine did go to court over the custody of their children, and the court gave Elaine full custody with visitation rights to Mark. So the reason that Elaine had wanted full custody of the boys was because Mark's relationship with his children had deteriorated over the last couple of years. Outsiders saw him as a loving, devoted father, but in reality, he was cold, he was harsh, and he was violent towards them. And both of the Redwine boys testified to this in court. So it's clear that Mark has some deep-rooted issues, Becky, and probably has never worked on them a day in his life if that's how he's treating his children. Let's be real. So just to be clear, and just so we're all on the same page, Dylan's mom doesn't get full custody of him until September 21st of 2012, when Dylan is already 13 and Corey is 20, and just months before Dylan goes to see his dad in Colorado.
And so Corey, there is no custody arrangement because he's an adult at this time.
Right.
So Dylan is the only one that has to go see his dad.
Exactly. And as we kind of found out earlier, he wasn't really all that excited to come and see his dad. He just wanted to stay home with his mom, see his friends, and play sports. But because his dad was allowed semi-regular visits, he had to go see him.
That's right. You don't want to go against the court.
Damn straight you
Bad
don't.
things happen.
Bad things happen when you break the law.
Go to jail. Go to jail.
Yeah, basically, it's just not good. Stay in line, do your dirt, listen to the law of the land, right? Listen, you hear? Bang, bang. That was my gravel, you know, like banging on
Did you say gravel?
Gravel? What is it?
Gavel. Going to shovel my gravel. Going
Dig
to listen
the
to
dirt
the law.
on the law of the land.
Sure, Bev. Whatever.
Jeez. This is why people think I'm just dumb. Right here. Common knowledge.
Gravel.
I don't have it. Like, you know?
Hit that gavel, Judge. But
bang
dig that
your
gavel.
gravel. Jeez. Woman embarrassment. My God.
But do you true crime, Bev? No, you don't.
Do I what?
Gravel.
Do I what?
I said.
Say it again.
But do you
say it again? Say it again.
But do you?
How
true
dare
crime...
you?
But do you true crime, Bev?
I'm sorry, you spoke too fast. I didn't hear anything you just said. So,
My
anyways,
God.
On top of all of this, Rebecca, as you know, there was actually another incident on top of the already fucked up relationship with his father that made it even more fucked up and made him really not want to go see his dad.
Yes,
and it is quite frankly fuck the fuck up.
Yes, it's a little traumatizing to say the least
for any young man to experience.
Yes, any child.
So what happened was that in earlier 2012, Corey and Dylan had gone on a road trip with their dad. And one night, they borrowed Mark's laptop. But when they logged in, they stumbled across some very provocative and equally disturbing photos of their father. And the boys were extremely upset by what they saw. In the photos, Mark is wearing a woman's wig and he's wearing lingerie.
Which arguably is not that bad.
No, I was going to say, it's not that part in and of itself, not bad. But the following photos were of Mark wearing diapers and then eating shit from the diaper.
Ugh.
It's gross.
It's disgusting.
It's disgusting. Let's be real. It's fucking gross. Now, probably because this is fucking disgusting, Mark had been hiding this fetish from his family and lovers.
Yeah, no shit.
Oh, nice one.
Thanks.
Loved that one, Beck. Good job.
Thank you.
So he was what is called a coprophiliac and scatologist, if you will. This is a fetish where people have a fascination with filth, and they use it for their sexual gratification. Some people like pooping on people, smearing it over the body, and or consuming it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Some of the more modern terms you may hear it referred to as are the Cleveland Steamer, Hot Carl, Hot Sasser, and the Dirty Sanchez.
Which kind of shocked me when I read about this because it is when you take the poop and you rub it, wipe it on the upper lip like a little stachio. So
wow.
If anybody asks you,
now you know what a Dirty Sanchez is.
Yes, you know, and don't ever agree to it unless you're into it.
And don't look up Google Photos, man. You don't want that on your browsing history, and you don't want to see it. Let's be real.
Yeah, I learned far too much about poop and fetishes recently, and no one checked my browsing history.
I believe that.
Yeah.
Now, all jokes aside, Bex, obviously this is a real fetish.
Yes.
And people live with these desires, and it's not something most coprophilics are super open about until they find an accepting and like-minded crowd.
Right.
And if you really think about it, it is like a smidge sad, if you will.
Beverly.
That Mark
A smudge sad. Get out of here.
that Mark, was doing this on his own. He couldn't tell anyone about it.
Oh, no.
I can't say it's a lot sad. It's just a smudge sad.
Oh,
But
no.
you can't imagine that finding these photos of your parent and how the boys must have felt.
Oh, totally not good.
Yeah, they must have felt like shit.
Oh my god.
I genuinely did not mean that one. Oh, that was wild.
Oh boy.
Okay, so seeing these photos, the two boys have a dilemma.
They sure do.
Do they just ignore it and go on with their lives with this secret? Or do they tell their father what they saw? No matter which way you slice it, from that point on, they're going to see their dad in a different light. And they might be wondering, what else is dad hiding? But ultimately, the boys decide to let this rest for now and finish the road trip and go home.
Yep. Solid choice.
But before they went home, Corey did make copies of the photos and upload them to his phone, which I can only assume is like blackmail. For blackmail, it has to be, because who the fuck wants those photos on their phone of their father?
Nobody.
You
know what, Bev? They actually take them because if they decide to confront their dad,
they have proof.
They want to have proof instead of him be like, nope, you didn't see that. Like, you're crazy.
Wow.
They want to be like, no, we have them. Don't lie.
That's fucking trippy.
I don't know if I would have thought to do that.
I wouldn't have. I would have shut it in fear and been like,
I wish to never remember this moment.
Yeah, exactly. So, not long after the road trip, Corey and Mark got in a text fight, to which Corey said, "Hey, beautiful, you are what you eat. Look in the mirror." So after he receives this text, Mark realizes that his boys know about his secret, and there is an unspoken tension between the boys and their father. Because I could imagine that Mark doesn't want anyone else to know, and I'm sure he's kind of fearful of his boys spilling his secret.
I would be.
Agreed. So Corey has the luxury of not having to see his father if he doesn't want to, but Dylan, on the other hand, still has this court-mandated visitations that he has to go to. Hence, Thanksgiving weekend, where he has to go see his father. Before Dylan leaves to go see his dad, Corey and him decide that Dylan would confront their father with the information they have.
Uh-oh.
Just to clear the elephant in the room. And this was all supposed to go down on that Thanksgiving weekend when Dylan goes to visit his dad in 2012. So even though the brothers decided to confront Mark, Dylan just really didn't want to go, as we had mentioned earlier, and he had begged his mom to let him stay home. But Elaine couldn't go against the courts, so she made him go. But to make it easier on Dylan, she had arranged hangouts and sleepovers with his friends. So before he goes to visit his dad, he got Corey, his brother, to send the photos to him so he would have proof while talking to his dad. They had both believed that once they cleared the air, it would be better for them all.
Right, get rid of that unspoken tension. Everything will be good.
Right. So eventually Dylan gets on his flight and meets Mark at the airport. Once he arrived, Dylan texted his mom. He confirmed that he met up with his dad, but the text had a frowny face. And while Dylan was there, his ultimate goal was still to spend as much time with his friends as possible. Throughout the evening, Dylan was in contact with his friends and mother via text up until 9:37 p.m. And that was the last text that his mom had received from him. And then the following day, Mark, as we know, had called Elaine saying that Dylan was missing. So this brings us back to kind of where we had left off where Elaine, Mike, and Corey are anxiously making the 5.5-hour drive to Bayfield, Colorado. When they arrive, the police and the community come together to search for Dylan. So not only was this a local community effort, but the story went national. Even Nancy Grace covered this story.
Yeah, and that's huge. So many people heard what was going on about Dylan.
Yes, and police were bombarded with tips from people that had seen Dylan. They also got a staggering number of psychics call in and claiming that they knew where he was. But ultimately, nothing pans out. And as minutes turn to hours, the belief that Dylan was just a runaway grew smaller and smaller. And everyone believed that something really terrible had happened to him. And given all the information that Dylan's family had regarding the dynamic of him and his father and what Corey knew about his father, they believed that Mark knew more than he was telling police. Mark's behavior confirms a lot of this notion. He kept to himself, he stayed in his home, and he would not help search for his missing son. He wouldn't even come out to chat with coordinators, which is a huge red flag. Your son is missing. You haven't seen him in almost a full day. You checked with his friends. No one has heard from him. You would think that a father who is genuinely concerned for the well-being of his son would be doing everything that he could to help find him. But that isn't the case here.
No, he literally becomes a complete recluse.
Yeah, but even though he wasn't involved in this search, he was oddly vocal with the fact that they should be searching the lake near his home instead of the large forest. So on top of his already suspicious behavior and him trying to direct the investigation in a certain way, several people also noticed that during a vigil held for Dylan, that Mark refers to Dylan in the past tense.
Oh man, we know what that means, Bev.
Yeah, it's like a internal cue for what they know but aren't willing to say, right?
Yeah.
It's like a Freudian slip, if you will.
Yeah.
So up until this point, despite their suspicions, the detectives haven't found any concrete evidence against Mark. So they decide to dig into his past a little bit. And they begin by speaking with Mark's first wife, Betsy, who had recalled from years earlier that Mark had told her if he had ever had to get rid of a body, he would hide it in the mountains. And during their divorce, he had told her that he would kill their children before he would ever let her have them. And of course, this really concerns the investigators. So they decide to talk to Mark. And when first talking with the investigators, Mark tries to throw Elaine under the bus and says, obviously, it's no secret that I believe Elaine could be involved in this. I don't know how she would do it. I don't know who else she'd have involved with it, but I can't help but think there's a possibility that she had some involvement. It seems clear that Mark he's just trying to sway the investigators and trying to direct the investigation in a certain way. But if he thought that this was going to help with that, he was completely delusional, because investigators start getting a weird feeling about none other than Mark. And after collecting some evidence, he actually became a person of interest. And on November 28th, the investigators officially rule out the possibility that Dylan was a runaway. And the following afternoon, they use cadaver dogs and search Mark's home. The dogs track the scent to the inside of Mark's home, and investigators use luminol and find small traces of Dylan's blood in the living room, as well as the back of his pickup truck. Mark tried to explain this away by saying that on the evening of November 18th, Dylan and he had been playfully roughhousing and that he started to bleed, but that it was minor, which is unfortunate because it was agreed upon that it was such a small amount of blood that they couldn't technically say that a crime had happened there. So no arrests were made. And I truly think that Mark lucked out with his story and the amount of blood that they found.
Oh, for sure.
Because if it was any more, his story would be completely implausible. And even though his story is already kind of sketchy, like you have some in the living room and the back of your pickup truck, like, where were you roughhousing?
Yeah, did it start in the living room and somehow you guys just tussled all the way into the back of your car or truck?
Yeah, so that's
right.
sketchy. But even though it's a sketchy story, they just
don't have the evidence
to say otherwise.
Exactly.
Now, what really started to concern the investigators is that Mark starts with a new theory about what happened to his son. And he says that Dylan had gone hiking and had gotten shot by a hunter and died. Now, this story tops the last one about the roughhousing because what the heck? If you had known he had died, why was this not conveyed in speaking with the police initially? Why was it not said when you were questioned? Why was it not said to his mother? Why did you go to his friends' houses? Like,
why didn't you call 911 immediately?
Yeah, like it's really ridiculous that he even thought this could be a potential theory or story about what happened to Dylan. Like, he should have just stuck with his roughhousing story. But why the investigators were concerned is that they didn't know if Dylan was alive or dead at that point. And how could someone having no knowledge of where his son went come up with that specific of a theory? So because of everything that Mark is doing and saying, Elaine and her husband, Mike, outright accuse Mark of killing Dylan. So now we have both parents of Dylan making accusations against one another, and both parties are denying any involvement. And it's getting heated. Investigators think that if everyone took a polygraph test, that it might chill everyone out so that they can put all of the wasted energy that's going on due to them fighting with one another into finding Dylan. But all the polygraph test does is create further suspicion on Mark Redwine because he failed his test, specifically on the question, do you know where Dylan is? Are you hiding any knowledge of Dylan's location? To which he answered no to both. At this point, Mark is looking pretty bad, but they still don't have that concrete evidence they need to confirm what happened to Dylan. Now, around the same time that Mark took this test, Corey, Dylan's older brother, comes forward with these photos of his father, and he gives them to the police. Again, this proves nothing, but it does make the investigators wonder, could this be the motive? Could Mark have killed his son just to keep his own secret? Now, we're going to fast forward a little bit at this point to February of 2013, and the family goes on to the Dr. Phil show while the investigation into Dylan's disappearance is still taking place. And the topic of the photos were brought up. And Mark said that they were photoshopped to make him look bad. Dr. Phil asks Elaine, Mike, and Mark to take another polygraph test. And Mark refuses.
Of course he does.
Because he's already failed once. He's looking pretty bad. Mm-hmm. So why would he do it once again, right?
Why would he?
Especially on national television. Let's get real.
Of course. And this, it actually puts him kind of in between a rock and a hard place because, one, if he takes the test and fails, it looks terrible, as you said. But two, if he refuses
like he did,
he also looks like shit.
Yeah, he does. He looks terrible.
Yeah. So I don't envy his position at all.
I don't either. But the sad part about this all is that even if his original test was a false fail and he was innocent, like you said, he's putting himself in a rock and a hard place because he's not doing anything to prove his innocence any further, which again implies his guilt. Just saying. That's my opinion, and I'm sticking to it, Becky.
Fair enough.
But either way, during the Dr. Phil episode, Mark flat out denies any knowledge of what happened to his son and where he may be. Even after the Dr. Phil show, there continued to be no new leads or evidence that come up, and it starts to feel really hopeless, especially having someone that the investigators suspect as being involved in the disappearance, but not having enough evidence to prove it.
Absolutely frustrating.
However, on June 27th of 2013, partial remains of a young boy are found. The young boy was wearing the same clothes that Dylan had been wearing on security footage from the Walmart that he and his father shopped at on the first night that he arrived in Colorado. The remains were found on Middle Mountain Road. It was about 100 yards from an AV trail and about 13 kilometers away from Mark's home. Now, what was eerie about that location was that a few months earlier, Mike, Elaine's husband, had seen Mark driving in that area alone before Mark ended up moving away from Bayfield, Colorado permanently. So he just packs up and leaves, and there was nothing anyone could do about it. And on top of him just peacing out and leaving town, Mark refuses to answer any more questions about his son. So if it wasn't obvious before with the clothes matching Dylan's attire, it should be now, because it is now confirmed that Dylan is the person that was found on that mountainside road. Now, after Dylan's remains were found, Mark did have a phone call with his son Corey, where Mark says that the rest of Dylan's remains, like the skull, would have to be found to determine if blunt force trauma was the cause of death.
This is creepy for a couple reasons. One, because the skull was not found with the partial remains
Of
so
Dylan.
It is somewhere else. So they totally cannot determine
whether it was an accident or murder.
Exactly. They have no idea. And then number two, who says that to their son during an active investigation?
Yeah, and honestly, who just says that to their son, period? It's just fucked up, right?
Yeah.
It's also really devastating because the truth of the matter is that what Mark is saying, although messed up in its own right and pretty revealing for him to say, he's not wrong. And even with the partial remains, the investigators still only have circumstantial evidence. But luckily, in November of 2015, so this is a couple years later, 2 hikers had somehow unearthed Dylan's skull, and it had been found about 1 mile from his other remains. Now, once the skull is found, medical examiners can finally come to the conclusion that Dylan had died of blunt force trauma, and his death was officially labeled a homicide. There was also no evidence showing that an animal had been responsible for displacing Dylan's skull, so they believed that his skull had actually been moved by somebody.
Hence why Mike saw Mark roaming around that area.
Whoa.
I mean, they can't prove that, but we can suspect.
No doubt. Like, what? Was he just holding onto his skull for said time? Like, damn. And he's just like cruising around, finding a good spot for it. Yuck.
Yuck is right.
And even though everyone's guts knew who it was, it took investigators and the district attorney an additional 2 years after finding the skull to formally charge and arrest Mark Redwine for the murder of his son Dylan.
Talk about a drawn-out process, hey?
No kidding. So on July 22nd of 2017, Mark was arrested at his new home in Washington and charged with second-degree murder and child abuse resulting in death. And just like the drawn-out investigation and how long it really took to find concrete evidence as to what happened to Dylan, the trial was also delayed for a multitude of reasons. Number one being that Mark's defense attorney was arrested for assault and domestic violence. And the second being that it was delayed due to the pandemic in 2020. So
Right.
The family waited a long time for Mark to be arrested and tried for his offense. But through this all, Elaine kept pushing forward, and she managed to keep her son's case in the spotlight. She also fought to have the charge of abuse of a corpse changed from a misdemeanor to a third-degree felony, which was absolutely amazing because they all believed that Mark had been the one to move Dylan's skull so that they wouldn't be able to figure out his cause of death. And if it had just been a misdemeanor, it basically would have just been a slap on the wrist for Mark. But with her changing or working to change it from a misdemeanor to a felony, he would receive jail time for that crime if convicted. This also meant that if somehow Mark wasn't found guilty of murder, he would still face jail time. And I would think that as a mother who's really trying to find justice for her son, this would be the best case scenario. Like, it's like a fail-safe, right?
Yes.
If you somehow are acquitted, you would still pay a price for the crime, right?
Exactly. And as his family, that would be the ultimate second best.
Exactly. As opposed to zero consequence.
Yeah.
So now finally, the trial commences in June of 2021. And unfortunately, the prosecution can only charge Mark with second-degree murder because they had zero evidence to prove that Mark had planned to kill his son. Regardless, they go forward with the second-degree murder trial, and now the defense argues a couple of things. Number one, they believed there wasn't enough blood to prove that Dylan was killed by blunt force trauma. Number two, Mark Redwine could not have gotten a fair trial because of his ex-wife's attempt to taint his name, and they had Facebook posts to prove this. Number three, they have no solid proof that Dylan's skull was moved by Mark. After all, in the mountain or forest area, there are bears, mountain lions, and other scavengers that could have killed or moved Dylan's skull. And after all, the medical examiner could not determine exactly when that skull fracture had happened. Now, to combat those arguments, prosecution brought in an expert that testified that blunt force trauma can occur without a lot of blood loss.
Isn't that the truth? You know, we can have damage done inside the skull, and just because there isn't blood, it doesn't mean that the damage couldn't be death.
Exactly, yeah. It's not always indicative to the severity of the situation, whether there's a lot of blood or not, right? You can just get smacked in the head on the temple and die.
Exactly.
Without any blood loss.
Yeah, so obviously that argument is a little moot.
Yeah, it's not a good one. The next thing that the prosecution addressed was the smear campaign and the unfair trial. They argued that regardless of what Elaine spoke publicly about the crime, that the initial media coverage was so far-reached that it didn't really matter what she said, and that Mark's own behavior made more of an impact towards tainting his reputation. And the judge agreed that it was fair. Now, in regards to the skull, the prosecution argued that there was no proof that an animal had killed Dylan, and although it was possible that it wasn't Mark who moved the skull, they had eyewitness, i.e. Mike, Elaine's husband, who saw Mark in the area of the remains. And because the medical examiner had determined that there were no signs of an animal attack or any post-mortem damage to the skull, as well as there was no decapitation injury, it could most likely be determined that the skull was moved to a different location at a later date.
Well, exactly. So the remains had sat there for a little bit, and then it would seem as though someone just walked on by, picked up the skull, and moved it.
Right. That's why there was no, it
Injury.
Didn't show that there was a decapitation. It's almost like the body had been decomposed, and therefore it was easy to just take the skull away from the body.
Yes.
And move it.
Possibly hide it to not be able to decipher the cause of death.
Potentially. What?
Did that happen, Mark? Unfortunately, there's not 100% proof, but they can kind of put this puzzle together.
And make a good argument for that.
Exactly.
Right? So Mark never takes the stand in this trial, which of course I think is smart because most people can sense bullshit, and he was full of it. Whoa. Whoa. Whoa.
In many ways.
Damn.
Oh, no.
So the jury and all the other people in court noticed Mark never showed any sadness. Not one tear did he shed the whole time. And then combined with the evidence, it did paint a clear picture and spoke volumes to the jury. And after just 6 hours of deliberation, the jury came back and found Mark Redwine guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse. Now, Mark has said that his trial was a sham, a miscarriage of justice, his conviction was a fake, and that he was unfairly crucified within the courts, and that he maintains his innocence. On the contrary, the judge said that the community needs to be protected from Mark and sentenced him to 48 years in prison for both counts of second-degree murder and child abuse. At the time of his conviction, Mark was a middle-aged man and most likely will be spending the rest of his days in prison. And if he ever gets out, he will be a very old man. We're talking 90s.
Possibly close to 100.
Yeah. So does he stand a chance? Nope. And thank God, because I agree with the judge.
He is a danger.
He is a danger.
If you can kill your son just to save your own face, basically.
Yeah. You're capable of a lot more than that.
That's right.
So our thoughts and prayers are with Dylan's family members. I couldn't imagine what they went through this whole ordeal and the death of their son. So yeah, just our thoughts are with you.
Absolutely.
So Becky, This is the case of Dylan Redwine. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for sharing.